I think the only way you can really translate this word Qing, that certainly was around, but it's really as closer to like clinical presentation, a little bit closer to the word symptom, if you will, although symptom is a new term that comes from Western medicine, and that becomes, to get into the academic argument, that becomes sort of like the wedge that sort of helps to separate Qing as a pattern. This is sort of come from Ted Kapchuk, is sort of, at least that's the term other people use, syndrome or manifestation, but that notion of pattern is really sort of it really emerges in the 1950s.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Geological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. You know those images of emperors, ministers, generals, and the other officials of state that we used to talk about Chinese medicine? I'm not sure why we do that, because if we talked in our everyday life using these archaic hierarchical terms, our friends would probably disown us for holding up a structure of privilege and oppression. Why do we continue to talk about our medicine with terminology that we reject in everyday life? Are we being intellectually lazy, or somehow not able to take the processes of the organs and elements and put it into our modern way of thinking? I've been noodling on this because when I talk to my patients about their liver being like a general or their heart being like an emperor, mostly it doesn't quite land for my patients. Yeah, they will often enough go along in a polite way, but I feel like I lose some credibility. So I'm playing around with other ways to talk about organ function in a way that more matches up with the shared experience of modern life. Here's a few ideas that I've been playing with. The liver is Amazon.com. Traditionally, the liver is considered to be a general. How many of us say these words in clinic? The liver is like the general when talking Chinese medicine, but in daily life, outside of our clinical walls, we have a dislike of the military and little respect for generals. Metaphors don't work well when you have a bad opinion about the character of the metaphor. So, when trying to explain the way that the liver can strategize and handle logistics, how it with military precision can store and move things around, Amazon.com, for me that fits the bill. Want to talk about a healthy liver function? Lean on Amazon. It works pretty well in my experience. Now, here in the United States, we kicked royalty out of our culture about 250 years ago. Bringing up the idea of the king these days, it veers more into fairy tale than give a firm footing for the idea that there's an aspect of us that is authoritative, protective, and communicative. I have a hard time with a, air quotes here, king, who is withdrawn from the world because he can't corrupt himself with the daily lives of people that he's supposedly looking out for. So he has his minister attend to the daily affairs because he's busy communicating with the divine on behalf of the people. I'm not buying it. First, because I've yet to see a head of state actually behave this way. And secondly, because regardless of the game you play, it's better to have skin in the game. A king that says he's doing work for the people without being connected to the people, somehow that doesn't add up. I'm thinking the heart is more like a local merchant, someone who is connected to the community through relationship and exchange. That business owner who seems to know everyone in the neighborhood, the one who in serving a community also creates a community. That is what the heart seems like to me. How about you? Do you have any ideas about taking the character and functions of the liver and the heart and talking about it in a way that doesn't lean on thinking like a resident of the Han Dynasty? If so, let me know. I'll be sure to share it here on the podcast sometime in a future episode. Because Chinese medicine has been around for a long time, it's easy to imagine that the medicine we practice today would be recognizable to a doctor from 1,000 years ago. Turns out, what you do in clinic today would be incomprehensible to a Republican-era doctor from just 100 years ago. The core of what you learned in school and proudly practiced in terms of treating the pattern, that was an innovation from the 1960s. There's a lot that I did not know about our recent history, and reading Eric Karchmer's Prescriptions for Virtuosity, the post-colonial struggle of Chinese medicine, it was both illuminating and it helped me to better appreciate the curious medicine that we practice. We'll be getting into this and more in a moment with Eric. Stay with us. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear Don't Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lyle, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com, and where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AccuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit AccuFastNeedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
Eric Karchmer, welcome back to Qiological.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. You wrote a book, The book is, I'm going to plug your book for a second because it's an amazing book. And we've actually talked a little bit about some of the things that are in this book in previous podcasts. The title is Prescriptions for Virtuosity, Post-Colonial Struggle of Chinese Medicine. Now you sound like a social justice warrior here. Anyway, this is an amazing book. I think any practitioner or student is going to find this utterly fascinating. It helps to take the medicine that we practice and kind of put it in a context. You know, often we like to think, oh, we're completely connected to the ancients in an unbroken chain back to Zhang Zhongjing. And it's more like a patchwork of things that have come down and have had their own influences through time and culture and governments and just influences of other countries, technology. It goes on and on and on.
Absolutely. You know, the book was in many ways kind of a journey for me. Well, I wrote it for doctors, and I talk about that actually in the introduction, but it was also began as a dissertation, and it's a book also for anthropologists and historians of Chinese medicine. So it's kind of tries to write to both the audiences, which isn't easy because they want different things.
Yeah. Well, part of its fascination for me is, as a practitioner, there's things that I glean from it that I find helpful. As not being an anthropologist, it gives me a view into a world that's there, but I'm usually not paying attention to it. Now, you've got kind of a weird origin story because you originally went to China, not to study medicine, but you originally went to China back in, I think, the 90s as an anthropology student to study like Chinese medicine doctors in an anthropological kind of way.
That's right. I really backed into the profession a little bit. I mean, the 90s I don't know if it's a long time ago, but, you know, I just didn't know that. I knew a lot about, I was very interested in China, but it just didn't occur to me that you could really study Chinese medicine and how to practice and be a clinician. And it seemed too far away. I don't think it was that far away, but we already had schools in the US back then, but they weren't on my radar. So, but I was fascinated with China and getting into anthropology as a grad student. And that was, so I went to do research on it, not knowing just how difficult that would be. The research part of it.
So you decided to learn the medicine instead because it was easier?
I mean, that is a little bit of a funny story. It was something you can't do. You couldn't possibly do it now. It would be, I think, almost impossible, at least the academic part of it, because I had started grad school in the early 90s. I'd actually spent a little time in China and also in Taiwan in the late 80s. And that's what sort of propelled me to grad school. And so the early 90s, I was doing grad school, kept doing all my coursework, preparing to come back for field work. And again, kind of fascinated with Chinese medicine, but it wasn't really on my radar as a career. It was perhaps something I could do research about. And then once I started doing it, I mean, there was a lot of factors, and I'm happy to tell you all the details if you want, but sort of one thing led to another. And the more I got into it, the more I realized just how difficult it would be to write this book, which then took me years and years and years to write. And in some ways, becoming the practitioner became a goal as I was going along. And that was actually almost more manageable than just the book and the research. And then that I sort of came back to the academic part of it later in the early 2000s. That's the short version.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so fascinating. You go as an anthropologist, you end up like going native. You learn the medicine as a doctor in Chinese in Beijing, right? That's pretty close to the source. And then you come back as an anthropologist and a practitioner. And years later, we have this book that only someone like you that's traveled in these two worlds. And I'm going to get into two worlds here in a moment, because you talk a lot about the two worlds of East and West, of science and tradition, and you articulate changes that have happened in our medicine. So let me just give you a quick example. Practitioners of the Republican era in China, right? Roughly 100 years-ish ago. Only 100 years. That's like an eye blink for Chinese history. I suspect they would look at us today and scratch their heads like, Chinese medicine? Like, we don't understand what you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the more remarkable parts of the research. And to maybe backfill a few steps, so I went to kind of first do an anthropology PhD, started doing it, realized just how hard that would be. And for a moment, I was like, well, maybe I'll just be kind of, after a year or two of kind of taking classes, it's also important to remember mention there was a couple of books, one by my advisor, Judith Farquhar. And then around that time when I was studying, Volker Scheid was just finishing up his book, or first his dissertation, but then his book came out called Contemporary Chinese Medicine. And when I saw Volker's dissertation, I was like, well, I don't think I have anything else to add. So maybe I'll focus on the being the practitioner.
It's done. Somebody did that job.
I really felt like the two of them had done that. Volker, when I finally did get to meet him in Beijing, I told him that. He said, "Oh, well, don't feel too bad, because that's exactly how I felt reading Judith Farquhar's book." He said, "You'll figure something out." And it took a little while, but I did. And so I did have this moment where I really focused on just learning to be a practitioner, and I was like, maybe I go back to anthropology, maybe I don't, but it was kind of good for me in the late 90s and I enjoyed it so much. And it was also kind of a special time to be in China. The late 90s was really a very dynamic time. It wasn't terribly expensive. So I could kind of do a few odd jobs and afford to kind of continue going to school there. Grad schools I was at UNC Chapel Hill, were a little bit more flexible, and there was still enough flexibility for me to kind of extend my time. And I took like multiple years leaves of absence, which you would never be allowed to do these days. That it's very strict. You've got 8 years, and then that's it. And so things kind of lined up to allow me to do that. And again, I was ready to put aside the anthropology degree even. And when I got to the very end of the training, and I finally got into the hospital, and I really saw what's going on in the hospital, and that was kind of maybe one of this. I didn't know that was coming, but that was one of the really special privileges of kind of going through the program in China, was I got to see how hybrid, how mixed things were. And then, because we had to do all this Western medicine training, which kind of confused me. And then I saw, okay, here's how it all comes together, or here's our doctors are bringing it together. And then at that moment, suddenly the anthropology seemed really relevant. And that's when I decided when I finish, I'll go back and try to complete the degree. Although it still took quite some time, and I got lucky. And even after finishing the degree, I had more. So you just referred to sort of the Republican era. I was able to get some more research money, head back to China, and I got to do probably the most exciting part of the book. It's really chapter 1, which is all these interviews with these very senior elderly doctors who were in their 80s and 90s at the time, and really got a picture of kind of Republican era medicine. Which then I also got to follow that on with some more kind of like historical research on that period as well. And that allowed the kind of like the two pieces, the clinical training, to come together with sort of some of that historical and oral history work. And that ultimately sort of like made the argument of the book.
Isn't it funny how we can set off on one particular path? It takes us to a place. Now we're in a different place. We kind of look around like, oh, there's these other things. That's interesting. I think I'll head this direction. And it's easy to think, okay, I've left this other thing behind. But you're actually taking this long, circuitous route back to it. And because of that, like, walk way out into the weeds, you've got all this stuff you would not otherwise have had. And it's incredibly helpful. So tell us a little bit about these old doctors that you interviewed, and like what their life was like. What was it like being a Republican era doctor? What was the landscape there? Their challenges? I mean, Western medicine was just beginning to really come into China in a big way. And, it's really helpful for lots of things. And so now we've got this new force, so to speak, this new influence coming from outside. It's coming around the time of just after the well, sort of commensurate with and after the fall of the Qing dynasty. So you've got all this trouble and change in China. And now you got Western medicine coming into the mix as well. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, that was one of the funnest parts of the book was and I interviewed about 40 different doctors, really from all over China. And these were many of, the names may not be too familiar to folks in the U.S., although some of them will, but they're very familiar. It's sort of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame of at least contemporary doctors for Chinese medicine. And in fact, that's how I was able to find a lot of the doctors, just because they were famous. I'm sure there was other ones that were still alive, but who were less so. But it just, it wasn't like there was a phone book I could open up. So, but the people who were known were the ones that I could sort of track down, and then not, of course, some of them were very old and really too sick to really, or too frail to be interviewed. But some were still healthy and open to talking to what I think would have seemed to them to be some sort of random American scholar. But one of the things I found, and this kind of maybe gets to a little bit the academic side of the book, was that the stories they told were all very different than what you might read in most of your history books. So if we take a look at the academic side of research in Chinese medicine, there's actually not a whole lot of anthropologists. There's sort of a handful, but Judy Farquhar and Volker Scheider are who I just mentioned are two of the very, very good ones. But there's a large number of historians. And one interesting thing about the historians is, it's starting to change maybe now, but almost all the historians don't really have a lot of training in Chinese medicine. So some of your listeners will be familiar with Volker. Volker is a practitioner. Judy Farquhar is not, but I am. So anthropologists are a little bit more interested in kind of getting, but Judy did study for a good year and a half in China. So she got to see things up close in the early 80s. But most historians are great historians, but a little bit less knowledgeable about the clinical stuff. And if you kind of read some of their accounts of the Republican period or late Qing period, to me, it's really missing that clinical side of the story. And that's what I think the doctors gave to me and were able to tell me about. And what I discovered was that actually it was more different. It was not the story that you were really reading about from your historians. And that difference persisted really up until, I'd say, the 1950s. So we have lots of accounts from historians of of Western medicine kind of making its way into China in the 19th century, first through missionary doctors, then through some translations. And then finally we have, for those of your listeners who are kind of into like early 20th century writings on by Chinese medicine doctors, you do have a handful of very famous doctors who do write about sort of Western medicine and Chinese medicine and trying to combine them. But what I found through the interviews is that the presence of Western medicine was so far, there was so much less of it than you would think from reading all those historical accounts. So, in fact, one of the first doctors I interviewed, he shocked me because we often hear about sort of political struggles between the two camps, and there certainly did exist, but what we don't realize is that there are sort of struggles at the very sort of most elite sort of upper echelons of political power at that moment. But for the average doctor, they really knew very little about Western medicine. And I remember asking one of my first interviews, well, why would you want to study Chinese medicine when so many doctors of Western medicine were attacking it? And he responds like, oh, it's just a kid from the countryside. I had no idea there was a whole other type of medicine. I just knew the medicine my uncle was teaching me. And so you heard that kind of story again and again. And so I think throughout the countryside of China, right up until into the 40s, there was essentially no Western medicine or very little, or things like nurses or sort of retired paramedics from the army who had a little bit of knowledge, but they weren't great clinicians. So the really good clinicians in the countryside, but also to a large extent in the cities, were really doctors of Chinese medicine. And another thing to keep in mind too is that, we often, and this is, I think, a challenge with some of the historical accounts, is that we often read sort of Western medicine as it is today, as we know it today, back into that history of the early 20th century. And Western medicine was just a very different thing back then. It changed so rapidly after World War II with, the development of antibiotics, but CTs and all kinds of technologies and emergency care interventions and all kinds of things that just we take for granted now, but just didn't exist. So one of the things you get either both from reading, if you kind of read some of the literature and you kind of like can erase some of those previous biases, or just speak to some of these doctors as I had the opportunity to, we just realized that Chinese medicine was the big game in town. And so one of the things I talked about in that chapter 1 was that all the doctors were very busy treating all kinds of acute infectious diseases, things like cholera, smallpox, typhoid fever, malaria, which were, and all of those things, and all of those kind of descriptions were, I have to say, were totally shocking to me, because when I was in the hospital, anytime we saw an acute case, I really saw doctors of Chinese medicine really scrambling to kind of like treat first with Western medicine, just get this patient under control. And then when they're stabilized or something like that, maybe we'll use our Chinese medicine. The story from those older doctors was that, oh no, we were the first line of defense clinically speaking. People came to us and they not only that, they expected results quickly. So we also have this idea that Chinese medicine works very slowly. And sometimes it does, but it does when you're treating chronic conditions, which often take a long time to develop and therefore take a long time to correct. But people also back in the 20s, 30s, and what have you, didn't have time for treating their chronic conditions. They just needed they had to treat the dengue fever or whatever that was like putting them flat on their back. And so, and they expected results quickly, and all these doctors said, and if you couldn't get results with a couple of treatments or two, patients didn't come back.
Right. So it's not like today, come in 10 times and maybe that'll help. No, these docs were treating acute illness and people expected results, and doctors got famous because they could treat certain kinds of acute illness. And yeah, Western medicine didn't have everything in its fabulous arsenal back then that it does today. And so Chinese medicine was a superior medicine. And the thing that, I mean, there's so much that's fascinating, but this idea that we have today that, and you hear it in China too, this would really, I mean, I was there in the early 2000s and I'd hear Chinese people say, oh, if you have an acute issue, Western medicine, right? If you have a chronic issue, Chinese medicine. And I'm thinking, you're Chinese and you don't know what the hell you're talking about. You don't understand Chinese medicine, right?
Well, there's also a kind of, and this brings you back to the contemporary moment. But there are a lot of pressures on doctors in the hospitals not to screw up. I mean, to put it kind of very, very bluntly. So when something acute comes along, they don't really want to mess with a Chinese medicine treatment, which they don't have a lot of experience with, and they don't want to just sort of say, and I would even ask doctors as a student, I was like, okay, this person's got an infection, and I see you just prescribe some antibiotics. I understand the rationale behind that, but, would it be possible to treat this just with, an herbal medicine prescription? And the response I got was, maybe, but we're not going to do that. I believe that it could be possible, but like, what if we do that and it doesn't work? Like, we'll get all the blame. We haven't followed standard protocols. There's no upside for kind of like fighting some battle that we romantically may want to fight, but in reality, in the clinic and sort of the realities of the hospital and kind of just, maintaining some sort of clinical standards, that's just putting your license, your career on the line.
Sure. You're putting yourself in danger. We have the same thing here. If it's acute and Western medicine has a solution for it, maybe even if it doesn't, still, it's like you go to the ER, because if you attempt that and it doesn't go well, you could lose your license and your reputation. But beyond that, we don't know how to do that anymore. There were things that those doctors could treat. They knew how to treat. We don't have it. When did we lose that?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't think I have the most complete answer to it, but the answer, some of the answers that it did get were sort of is that certainly things started to change in the 1950s. And of course, you have some very experienced doctors. The people I interviewed, remember, would have been still relatively young in the 1950s. They might have been in their 40s, let's say, or they might have been in their 30s. And now you also started younger too. So a lot of times, if you're doing an apprenticeship, you started when you're a teenager and you're kind of practicing by your early 20s. And so you may have 10 years or 15, 20 years of experience. So you might be quite good by the time So some of those younger doctors who I still got a chance to talk to were probably already quite experienced when they got to the 50s. And there's obviously ones who are older than them as well. But part of what happened also is that you have the introduction of hospitals of Chinese medicine, which didn't really exist prior to that. So prior to 1949, most doctors were operating in a private clinical practice, not that unlike what people do probably in the US today. But hospitals are sort of being invented in the 1950s, if you will, more or less. That's a bit of a crude statement, but more or less true. And they're being invented for Chinese medicine, and they're being modeled, of course, on a hospital of Western medicine. And from the very beginning, Western medicine doctors were involved, and also administrators themselves often may have, or quite likely, were people with some sort of biomedical training, some sort of background too, and that. So from the very beginning, there was a sort of a set of biomedical standards that kind of came in with the hospital, and it was very important to kind of meet them. And some doctors, told me that basically you essentially weren't I think it's Li Jingyong told me that if you, in his hospital in Wuhan, if anyone came in with a fever, immediately administrators were sort of saying that's going to be for our biomedical doctors to treat. Doctors of Chinese medicine aren't going to touch that patient. And so those are situations where the older doctors knew how to treat it, would have had a method, probably would have been very successful at it, but it just couldn't teach it to the younger doctors. And so pretty quickly that kind of is lost. And then of course, by the mid 1960s, you also have the Cultural Revolution. So it's even more disruption in terms of what can be passed on and what is possible to preserve and not. So I really think kind of by the late 50s and the early 60s, the trend was set. And of course, another important fact is that the Chinese government at the time was really trying to build a national healthcare system, if you will. There weren't a whole lot of hospitals of Western medicine either, or a lot of doctors of Western medicine. And so a lot of resources from the government were being put into building those institutions, training those doctors. Now, they were also making hospitals of Chinese medicine as well, but the resources were really going towards building biomedicine.
More toward the Western. So there's a dichotomy in your book. You talk about a number of different dualisms. And one of them that you bring up is purity versus hybrid, which I think is really interesting. And what I'm hearing you say with these hospitals of Chinese medicine, they were basically administered and built by people who had a Western medicine background. So already you've got that influence seeping in. They were from the beginning a kind of hybrid practice. This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code QIOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account.
That's right. So from the beginning, it is very hybrid, and from the beginning of the communist period. And so it's important to point out that prior to that time, that hybridity, there was some of it was there. So, but in a very different context. So, beginning with the mid 50s and on, you have sort of a state-driven imperative, if you will, to build a certain kind of hospital with certain kinds of protocols, which then require that the hospitals for Chinese medicine will have both Chinese medicine and Western medicine. That didn't exist in the Republican period, although you did have But it's a super interesting period. So you did have very interesting scholars. So to me, one of the joys is also reading some of the writings by these folks who they're cited. I cite them very widely, and it's probably chapter 3 and 4, maybe. Folks like Yun Tia Chow or Lu Yanlei or a few others who were fascinating people who were more or less sort of self-taught, if you will, in biomedicine, extremely knowledgeable in Western medicine, also extremely knowledgeable in sort of classics. They're sort of, if you will, they're maybe the last generation of people to really be trained in kind of the Confucian classics in a way that would go away with kind of a modern education system. They weren't quite training for like their civil service exam that ends in 1905, but some of those traditions of scholarship carried on. And these were people who were deeply knowledgeable in that way and a little bit, but also sort of getting a lot of training in modern science and a whole bunch of sort of new ideas that are coming in from the West. But those are folks who are sort of like trying to find ways to like bring in ideas from Western medicine to improve their Chinese medicine, to help or rethink the classics or innovate in some ways that were still really focused on Chinese medicine. In the Communist period, so that's already some hybridity there, but in the Republican period, but with an emphasis on Chinese medicine. In the Communist period, it's hybridity is sort of like state-driven, if you will, or a state imperative, and it's really a requirement of kind of the way you're going to see patients in a clinical setting. And so, and I think what happens, and so you mentioned these ideas of purity and hybridity, you get a lot of mixing, but at the same time, you also have, and this is where I think some of the other historical work that's been done, and there's some very good historical work, so I don't mean to be like sort of trashing all of that. There's some amazing historical work that's been done on the Republican period. But what you see that's happening in the Communist period is you see sort of a narrowing. And if you were to read some of these other historians, I think Bridie Andrews and Sean Lay are maybe two of my favorite about the Republican period. They can give you a description of like a whole range, an incredible diversity of practice, not just sort of the elite, literate scholar doctors, if you will, but they can kind of describe like a real range of practices that have maybe more based in Buddhist monasteries or religious practices or just like granny shamans and things like that. A lot of that gets eliminated, washed away, or sort of narrowed down. And so Chinese medicine becomes more narrow and professional, and it's much more in dialogue with a Western medicine profession. And so this big, diverse, amorphous thing that we might call Chinese medicine, but that's using the term for much more broadly than we used it back then. All that becomes narrowed down to this thing that is both sort of set up in a kind of relationship with professional biomedicine today. And so the two are sort of in a dialogue, in particular, the Chinese medicine doctors are very much in a dialogue with Western medicine. And because also the doctors are now learning both, that's just the huge difference. Now in the beginning of the 1950s and then on, you need to learn both, just like I did. So you're learning both. And so you're in your mind, and then of course, if you're doing your practice, you're in a constant dialogue between the two things. This is what you do in Chinese medicine does, or this is what you do in Western medicine, Chinese medicine is this way, or this is how you mix them together. And so you're always either going back and forth or sort of purifying them and separating them. And Chinese medicine changes and shifts in that whole sort of process of this weird dialogue where you're both opposed to Western medicine, because there's got to be something different about it, right? We've got to be Chinese. We've got to have our special characteristics. There's the word in Chinese would be tudian that people would talk about a lot when I was a student. Got to have our tudian. Yeah, we got to have our special point.
Our special thing, our special point, the thing that makes us unique.
Yeah, so we have to be both unique, but also similar enough that there's a way to combine them somehow, similar enough that you can't call us non-scientific. I think that was always a big fear. Always was. Maybe there's a little bit of a shift in that too, but always heard doctors, saying it. Chinese. They wanted to make sure that I understood this. Chinese medicine is scientific, and so there was always a fear of being called, superstitious or non-scientific or something that's less solid. In Chinese medicine, again, kind of by definition, is going to be all the less solid stuff.
Yes. So this, we run into this too here. I think in our modern moment, I think there's a lot of fear about being considered non-scientific. Folks often will like to point to research that says, look, see, Chinese medicine works. See, Chinese medicine's useful for this. See, we are scientific. How do we know we're scientific? We have research on Chinese medicine that proves that we're scientific. But I've heard Brenda Hood has said this to me, and it just kind of landed, and I thought, ooh, I think she's right. She said, Chinese medicine is not completely rational. Right? She's not saying it's irrational, and she's not saying that it's not scientific. She's saying it's not completely rational. And you're laughing. What are you laughing about?
Well, I'm laughing. I know Brenda. She's a friend of mine. I can imagine her saying that. Well, I would say there's also an interesting distinction. This might be helpful for your readers, listeners, and hopefully my readers to keep in mind too, which is that the way people think about Chinese medicine in China is not the same as how they think about it here. And so one thing that I just feel like people are forever disappointed in me as a clinician is that they always want something, often patients, or if I'm talking to practitioners, I always want something a little bit, they also always want a little bit more of the magic, the non-rational, I think. Something a little bit of more of, and I really went looking for that too as a student, that there's sometimes a celebration of the difference here. And I think of anything that's a little bit more kind of in the spiritual, psychological realm. Patients kind of want that, and practitioners often want to give that, but that's not what really drives doctors of Chinese medicine in China. They really want to be practical. They want results, or they're less inclined to kind of experiment and go too far into something a little bit kind of new agey, if you will. That would be precisely part of the attraction of Chinese medicine here in the West. So I'm chuckling about that because I think that's also a little bit what's at play is that people want this, especially I think in the West, they want the non-rational.
Yes. So, back to purity and hybrid, and I'd like to hear a little more about that. I mean, I get the hybrid piece, the purification part. I'd like to hear a bit more, but back to this idea that Chinese medicine may not be completely rational, and there's aspects in the States that people would like to get from it. Is that part of the purity of Chinese medicine, or are we actually hybridizing Chinese medicine with our Western mind and our Western psychology and our culture as it is at the moment?
I might say that is part of the purity. Well, so let me come back to that argument a little bit. And so part of the argument I tried to make is that this is very, very obvious. You already made one of those statements, and I tried to organize the book around some of these very common little nuggets of wisdom that you hear people say. But this idea that Western medicine treats acute diseases and Chinese medicine treats chronic diseases. Another thing you hear very commonly in China is that Western medicine treats structural or organic diseases, depending on how you translate it, but it's referring to almost things like surgery, whereas Chinese medicine treats functional diseases. And I would have people tell me that. They're like, I'd say, I'd ask my friends, or I say, can I treat this with like something I hadn't heard of? I'd call them up and say, can I treat this as the patient came in with this, and this, and this? And they'd want to know about, I don't know, x-rays, blood work, et cetera. And they're like, yeah, it sounds like a functional disease. You can treat it. And but those are all ways of kind of where we kind of oppose East to West. And I think those are all kind of purifications. And I think the non-rational versus the rational is another way of kind of purifying things and saying. But I think what happens is that at the same time we refer to these purifications. Now the other big one, and this is the whole second half of the book, is that Chinese medicine treats patterns. So this is Bian Zheng Len Zhi, and Western medicine treats diseases. So that's sort of half the book is sort of devoted to like kind of like unpacking that and where did it come from and why did people say that, and that's just something that couldn't have been said 100 years ago.
It couldn't have been said 100 years ago.
No, it could not have, because the terms have shifted. So now you can, and so this is where maybe the book gets a little technical, although I think this is maybe where the doctors, as readers, might be the most interested, and I think the anthropologists might be trailing off at this point. But in the kind of the middle or towards the end of the book, I try to kind of give a history of the terms, if you will. And so that, the term for disease in Chinese is Bing, and the term for pattern in Chinese is Zheng. But if you look at those terms, and so it's a very clear what people mean by that today. Now, one complication is that we can also talk about a being within Chinese medicine, as well as a being or disease in Western medicine. So that's already a little bit murky. But then if you start rolling back the clock, if you will, 100 years ago, they just didn't mean the same. This didn't mean the same thing. And I think the only way you can really translate this word Zheng, that certainly was around, but it's really as closer to like clinical presentation, a little bit closer to the word symptom, if you will. Although symptom is a new term that comes from Western medicine, and that becomes, to get into the academic argument, that becomes sort of like the wedge that sort of helps to separate Zheng as a pattern. This is sort of come from Ted Kapchuk, is sort of, at least that's a term other people use, syndrome or manifestation, but that notion of pattern is really sort of it really emerges in the 1950s as a term and as a description of what Chinese medicine doctors do. And disease diagnosis becomes a description of what Western medicine doctors do. So there's a whole chapter kind of devoted to textbooks, which are written in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And I know among practitioners in the U.S., there's a lot of kind of trashing of the textbooks and the rejection of them. And people were like, we do classical Chinese medicine. We don't do TCM. TCM stands for something that comes from the textbooks. But I find the textbooks kind of a remarkable achievement. And one of the things they did do, for better or worse, and in the end, I came down on better. I think it was an accomplishment, not without problems though, was that they sort of came up with this. We had to, again, this is one of the characteristics of Chinese medicine. One of them is we're going to do diagnosis a different way, and we have to name it, and we have to kind of like describe it and kind of put some steps to it, if you will. And that's what's going to be called bianzheng lunzhi, pattern discrimination, treatment determination, however you'd like to translate that term. And so that is part of the purification. As part of the purification, we have to say that we do it a certain way, and it's different than Western medicine. Of course, but then when you see in the hospital, as you see all the ways that the doctors make the two of them work together.
So it's both got bianzheng lunzhi both has aspects of purity, but also aspects of hybridness.
Absolutely. And so and now I use another kind of academic term in the book, which is this term post-colonial.
I was wondering about that. I mean, I'm kind of an old guy, so I hear things post-colonial, decolonialize, and things like this, and I don't really understand it. So I'd love to. I mean, actually, I want to. Maybe this is the moment to talk about that, or maybe we stick a pin in it and come back later, because I really want to make sure that we finish up with this Bing versus Zheng and bianzheng lunzhi, and like what Bing meant 100 years ago. Because these days, and you talk about this beautifully in the book, where someone will come in and it's like, oh, they got hepatitis. It's a liver disease. And you would watch doctors prescribe herbs, and it was primarily digestive formulas because they were treating the Zheng and they were treating a Bing, but it wasn't the Bing named hepatitis. It was the Bing that evolved out of what we call hepatitis, but showed up as a presentation in the body as a digestive issue. But to make sure that they did their due diligence, they threw in some chai hu and some bai xiao and, maybe some yen hu suo. I mean, whatever it is that they think is a good liver herb for air quotes hepatitis. But that's because they were treating a Western named Bing. But the Bing that they were treating was not a disease name. It's almost like the Bing and the Zheng. They're two sides of a coin, but they are not separate.
Yeah, I think it's a great moment to kind of talk about that word post-colonial and then try to talk about that shift, which is, it takes me a couple of chapters to kind of get through it, and hopefully it's relatively clear by the end of it. But so just to circle back to kind of it's an academic term, and we hear about decolonization today as sort of the big trend, and that's an important idea, but an idea that was a little bit more, but it was preceded by this other idea of post-colonialism, which became kind of popular in the 1990s. So that's how it kind of influenced me, like in academic circles. But, we have, just speaking in broad strokes, we have the colonial moment of European and in China, also Japanese colonialism that kind of leads up from the 19th century on into the first part of the 20th century. The post-colonial moment, and it's a term that not all Chinese scholars love to use, but I think it's appropriate here, is really trying to talk about after decolonization, not the political protests here today, but the decolonization of all the European colonies that happens after World War II, sometimes like early 1947 for India, obviously China, some different story. We have the but it's happening right after World War II in China, and because the Japanese and all the Europeans are leaving, and then we have the Communist Revolution. But that happening later in Africa in the 1960s, and even as late as 1975, and certain places, and with sometimes uprisings and movements. But so there's a sort of political decolonization movement that happens then. But one of the things that sort of scholars are writing about in the 1990s is that, well, we kind of got rid of the colonial master, if you will, but we're stuck with all of their kind of that colonial legacy. And it's just sort of being, in some ways, some of the same policies are just being carried on now by native elites, and so you could think, and so in China, we have kind of, it's not like there was no going back to kind of a world sort of pre-Opium War world. There's no going back. Modern medicine and modern science and all kinds of social policies and all those things were coming. Now they're coming in a Marxist form, if you will, but they're still coming. It wasn't like it was going to have a Marxist spin on it, but a centralized state that controls the nation up to certain boundaries. All that was sort of coming. And one of the things that post-colonial scholars like to talk about is how, even though the colonial master is gone, the reference to Europe, the reference to the West is always there. And that was what was so obvious to me in Chinese medicine. We couldn't do Chinese medicine without always thinking about this Western medicine. So when I was a student, Western medicine was always the point of judgment. I was always the touchdown for setting if this thing, we could or couldn't do this thing in Chinese medicine. I always had to sort of think about, you could start treating a patient with Chinese medicine, but the patient couldn't get out of the hospital without a biomedical diagnosis. That was the part that doctors were clearly so focused on. So the post-colonial moment is a moment where the power relations between the two professions, Western medicine and Chinese medicine, and first of all, the two, they kind of narrow down, as I say, but one where it shifts decisively, and Western medicine is sort of now going to be on top in China. Chinese medicine is going to be secondary. And that's just, even though Western medicine was already in China in the early 20th century, Chinese medicine was just sort of still on top just because the predominance of Chinese medicine doctors, and there were so many more. There's at least 10 times more. And in many places in the countryside, there was just no Western medicine at all. So that power relationship, that I use that term to try to capture that moment, that shift in power relations where Western medicine is on top and Chinese medicine is the second-class citizen, if you will. And Bianzhong Linzhi is also emerging at precisely that moment when that power shift is happening. And hospitals are being built precisely at that moment when that power shift is happening. And so if you kind of try to break it down, and this is sort of, I think it's chapter 5, where I try to give a very extensive look at a case, you just see how the two have to be done together and how Western medicine predominates in kind of the case record, and Chinese medicine is kind of added on, if you will. And so there's a whole way in which the two have to work together. Bianzhong Linzhi is both a way of describing what is unique about Chinese medicine. It's very much the purification against sort of a disease diagnosis in biomedicine, but it also kind of doctors made it work in a way so that it could also kind of work together nicely with Western medicine. So for example, we have within a certain disease, let's just go back to hepatitis for a second, you could kind of come up with some common patterns like this in a textbook if you want. You could say, we might have heat and dampness in the spleen, and you might have liver stagnation, and you might have a couple other patterns or something. You might have liver blood stagnation, cheese you might have a couple of different patterns that you could kind of list in a textbook. And that kind of is a way of kind of very conveniently kind of connecting up the two medicines. And that's actually what you really see in the Cultural Revolution, that way of putting the two together. And to me, it's both kind of, it's in many ways, it's exactly what I saw in the hospital a lot, but it's also, there is a kind of innovativeness to it because it just hadn't been done before. How do you put the two together? Well, in many ways, some of those textbooks that emerged in the Cultural Revolution just do that. There's just like the gloves are off, and we're just going to go ahead and mix it together in certain ways. So to me, that's the post-colonial moment where you really see the purification, the trying to hold the two things apart at times, but also the integration or the hybridization where you can put them together too if you want to.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner. Because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital qi. And that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
This is so fascinating, Eric, because, and look, I'm no scholar or historian. When I think of the Cultural Revolution, I think of we are completely losing our minds and we're getting rid of anything that has to do of that decadent West. And what I'm hearing you say is there was also a moment where Western medicine, Chinese medicine got glued together in a very profound way.
Well, I think it's a period that's hard to do good research on. And so what I say about it is a little bit piecemeal, but I would just back up and say the Cultural Revolution, as we sort of hear about it in the West, of course, is this very hyperbolic, oversimplified kind of thing. And so we tend to, there's a whole literature that kind of came out in the kind of late 90s and early 2000s, just about sort of in English often, that was recounting, the sufferings of different families through the Cultural Revolution, often elite families, highly educated, how they suffered. And certainly that's a big part, certainly that is a part of it. That all happened, but it doesn't capture the whole thing. And so I wouldn't say it's not something I'd want to sell. I don't think nobody wants to go back to it, but it is kind of some fascinating things did happen. And one of the really interesting interviews I had was I did interview many doctors that were writing textbooks, and the Chinese internal medicine textbook is one of the ones that I really followed pretty closely. And that also changed. That's the one that really changed dramatically during the Cultural Revolution. And I remember I finally got to speak to one of the editors of that textbook, somebody who was quite involved in it. And he was involved because he himself had been what we call an integrated medicine doctor, a zhongxi jiehe, so a doctor of Western medicine who, in the kind of sort of Maoist enthusiasm from blending the two medicines in the late 50s, early 60s, I think it was the late 50s. He then was trained, got 2 to 3 years of training in Chinese medicine. And so he was this sort of vanguard of this core of doctors that never got to be too big, but they were really trained in both and who were going to lead the way in some remarkable new sort of Mao called it new medicine. But he came out of that program, and
which I think they were saying, they were calling it an integrated medicine, weren't they? Weren't they calling it integrative medicine basically in Chinese? Zhongxi jiehe.
Zhongxi jiehe is the name, yeah. And that's a name that gets used in a couple of different ways, but one of the very specific ways is it referred to all those doctors, and there was kind of a group of them. Many of them went on to be quite famous and quite influential in certain ways. And but they were some of these doctors who in the late 50s, early 60s got trained. And sometimes one of the remarkable things is sometimes they got trained by some of the best doctors of Chinese medicine. So they really got to work with these, which is not how I felt like, not like what I thought I got as part of my education. You don't always necessarily get taught by these great doctors. So they get taught by some really remarkable doctors, really worked closely with some of these doctors and really learned Chinese medicine, already having a solid foundation in biomedicine and obviously clinical practice. So for the folks who could kind of get into it, not everyone, a lot of people didn't like it. They didn't want to, they weren't open to that, and they were still sort of forced to do it. But there was a handful of some of these folks who really took to it and then went on to do some very influential things. And one of them was quite involved in writing this Chinese internal medicine textbook in the it was kind of late. It was probably like 78, 79. And he's like, this was later was criticized because with the fall of the Gang of Four, the rise of Deng Xiaoping, and the Reform era, there was a kind of reversion back to kind of what things were pre-Cultural Revolution. He says, but he was, really hurt by it. He's like, I really thought we did something remarkable with this textbook. Nobody had done this before. And look at how we took some of these biomedical diseases and we showed you how you can treat them with Chinese medicine. We're going to break them down into 4 or 5 different kind of commonly seen patterns. And again, that's a very new thing that kind of came out of that. Barefoot doctors are another kind of that's a whole other topic, but that's another thing that comes out of that period too. So, anyways, it's a bit of a, it's not something I dive into too much. And there is a very nice book on barefoot doctors written by Felt Shopping for people who want to dive into that a little bit more.
But yes, I remember in the book you talk about the textbooks. And some of the editions were like, yes, there's a lot of great information. Some of the editions were like, yeah, not as good as the older one. But especially the first 2 editions, and I think this is what you're speaking to here, we really do see Bianzheng Lunzhi kind of coming into being. And like you said, especially I think it was the second revision, where here's some Western disease names and processes, and here's ways that we can think about it in Chinese medicine. They were pretty clear about it. And I think in many ways, that is part of the legacy that has come down to us today, because I think much of our training in school, at least when I was there, we had all kinds of stuff. Part of it was look at Chinese and Western medicine this way, or look at Chinese medicine to treat disease like this. And there's your boxes and flowcharts and this and that. But I would also have teachers who would say, you need to know this, you need to learn this, you need to see how these things work. Don't put your patients in a box. So here's the boxes, and the boxes are helpful, but there's a bigger medicine outside the box. You need to know them both.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I think that I think one of the frustrations for people who feel restrained by TCM or whatever they think TCM is, usually it's sort of textbook medicine, is that it just seems too confining, too restraining. But I would say that seemed to be almost taken for granted, that nobody should ever stop with the textbooks. That was just sort of a start. That was like to build the foundation. And then you're going to go on and figure out how you want to do it. This will just give you a place to start. And so what you do see with those early textbooks is, and I think also another important thing too, to kind of keep in mind, is the textbooks, I think, mean one thing to like a student like you or me, coming at it like in the 90s, the 2000s, studying Chinese medicine from that. And it means another thing to some of the older doctors that were involved in running them. And so I had one of the great honors was I had a chance to interview Deng Tiatao in Guangzhou, quite famous doctor, advisor to Brenda, who you mentioned earlier. And he was involved in those early editions. He was very proud of some of the things that were there. And he would tell me about look, people forget this, but here's what we wrote in the second edition textbook. And it's important that they don't do it. And I actually remember asking very specifically, I was like, okay, but this term bianzheng linzhi, it's new, right? It's like, I can't find it in any writings of the 1930s or 40s or earlier or anything. It's just not there. And he was very honest. He was like, oh yes, that's a new term. It didn't exist. But he said, but the spirit was there. And I think for him, and I interpret that as sort of, in a certain sense, as sort of the textbooks for them, I think capture a certain kind of spirit of like the way they learn medicine, which was much more closely tied to some of the classics. But it was also doing this one other thing that I think that, perhaps he didn't quite see so well, but has a much bigger influence on the later generations, which it was sort of fulfilling that post-colonial requirement of making bianzheng linzhi both this thing that's sort of like different than Western medicine, but also this thing where you kind of can help bridge the two in that sort of cultural revolution sense, or in the hospital, the way you do it in the hospital. And so I think later generations look at the textbooks and they see that thing, and they're frustrated with being jungle manure as they see it, but they don't think for the editors and the authors of those early textbooks. I don't think it meant a different thing to them, partly because they came out of a whole different kind of training and a whole different kind of experience of being practitioners in a moment when Western Chinese medicine was still really the dominant form of medicine. Western medicine didn't have all these therapies and options, and it was a much less technical medicine. And, so I think this is my interpretation, of course, reading his comments, but I think that my guess is that probably captures it. Like it felt like very much a continuation for those editors, but I think for later generations, it can feel like a break. And yeah, that's sort of how I experienced it too. I said, as a student, I was like, there's something crazy about this. I can tell this is brand new. Like I could just read between the lines and say, this is obviously not the way Chinese medicine has always been done, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't say why. I couldn't explain how it changed or any of that for the years and years. And that's where some of the later historical work then kind of came in to help kind of like fill in those gaps. I could sense it, but couldn't explain it.
Well, I am grateful for your noticing that as a younger person, younger doctor in the process of learning and holding that question, because it over the years evolved into this book. I'm so fascinated by, and I see this all over the place all the time, how the solution of one moment, like here's an amazing innovation, right? These doctors in the 60s, the second revision of that book, and they come up with this idea, they kind of glue these different pieces together, and it gives them a way of going forward and also being connected to the past, but they've also created something new. Anytime we create something new, new solution, right? And it works in that moment and it's helpful, it sets up problem down the way. All of our solutions, I think Chip Chase said this. I think this is where I first heard he said, all solutions are temporary. Right? And let me just finish this thought. It seems to me in some ways, and I'm speaking about here in the West, we're kind of going through our own, I'm going to use your term, purification process. Well, our medicine's not TCM, blah, blah, blah. We're the real, or we're the classic, or we're the, fill in the blank. Okay, you could use that as marketing. You can use that as a way of creating an identity, but whatever. But in reading your book, it seems to me that we're going through our own modern moment of what we purify, what we hybridize, and how we use that as kind of an identity for who we are as a practitioner.
Yeah, I think you're right on with that comment. And I would say we're very much part of that post-colonial moment in the West, but with a slightly different kind of flourish, if you will. These debates about traditional and classical Chinese medicine are the classic example, because those terms that don't even exist in China, that nobody knows what that means. And so I think we're very much part of that legacy for sure. And but I like your point about innovation, which is really important. And I don't know if I make it strongly enough in the book, but if you were to go back and look, you could take all the doctors that I got to interview as examples. Dong Tao, for example, all those doctors, as I mentioned, they became well known. The reasons they were maybe invited to participate in textbook editing in the early 60s, or the reason why they became maybe leaders in their hospitals or wherever they were, was because they were quite successful, and we know that they were successful in the Republican period because they were successful at treating all these acute illnesses. So that's what they did. There wasn't a whole lot of, sure they did some chronic diseases, but there wasn't a whole lot of that around because that's just, people couldn't afford it. It was a whole different marketplace, if you will, of medicine. But in the communist period, they all become masters at some sort of chronic disease. So Dong Tao, to give an example, becomes very famous for his treatments of myasthenia gravis. Zhang Qi, who's up in Harbin, becomes very famous for treating renal insufficiency. All of them, cancer, what have you, heart disease, they all become very proficient at treating these chronic diseases that they didn't probably treat that much of as a young doctor, but as that sort of acute medicine part is sort of taken away just by the development of the whole medical institutions in China. they develop these other expertises, and it's and part of that expertise also is bringing a kind of knowledge of Western medicine into that. So if they hadn't studied Western medicine in the Republican era, they certainly did in the communist era, and so they then find ways to kind of bring that into their practice to help, guide and shape and condition the way they become master at treating these Western medicine diseases with Chinese medicine. So there's just sort of these multiple layers of innovation that are happening, and so if you kind of can step back and see that, it's a remarkable story, and that's how I came to see it at the end, which is actually not how I started. And in some ways, the post-colonial thing was an idea I had on early on, but to me, the story I wanted to tell was how Chinese medicine was oppressed. It was oppressed in these maybe complicated ways. It was oppressed by the biomedical profession. It was oppressed by very biased government officials. It was oppressed by all these different forces in the country and the world. And towards the end, of course, that is very true. What was even more powerful to me was all the innovation and all the successes that happened sort of in spite of that. And it took me a long time to I think to appreciate that. But that was sort of when I finally got to like writing it and finishing it and all that. That was the story that I realized was the really important one to me, which was how impressive it was.
Eric, I listened to you say this. You started off with one idea. You kind of had an axe to grind. Okay, you had a narrative. I got this idea, and I'm going to go prove it. And you go and do the work. And you come away from it thinking, oh, there's a lot more to it than I thought there was. This is probably the best reason why anybody should read this book, is because it will take them on the journey that you went through. And you start in one place and you honestly end up in another. That to me is the mark of a true scientist, whether it's hard sciences or social sciences. You start in one place, you've got an idea, you do the work, and you go, turns out to be like that. How about that?
Well, it is very much a kind of an accounting of my own journey, both as kind of doctor in training and anthropologist in training, if you will, and something of a historian in training too. And I did truly end up in a place I did start in. I started it, and probably, I don't think it would be that different than, although I was coming in as an anthropologist, I don't think I would be that different than anyone else coming in. Brenda, I think it was the same too. All of the foreign students that came to study Chinese medicine in the 1990s in China, we were all mad about studying Western medicine. We're like, we're here for Chinese medicine. Why do we have to spend all this time learning biochemistry, pathology? How is that going to help us be a doctor of Chinese medicine? And so that was a bit of the axe to grind. We were frustrated. And then somewhere along the line, one of my teachers said to me, maybe Brenda was even there. We were just complaining, like, why do we have to spend so much time in these courses? It's already so hard. We just want to do this one thing. And he just looked at me and he said, what's wrong with you guys? Like, isn't it always better to learn two languages rather than one? And it was such a simple statement. It's like, I could not refute that statement. And so I had, and as an anthropologist too, like, we always want to respect what anyone locally is telling us. And so I had to come around. But but again, the more I looked at it, that was really, it took some time, but the more impressed I came away, and I think that gets maybe back to the title of the book, the last big chapter called Prescriptions for Virtuosity. And to me, that kind of captured like the really key point, which is that, I was kind of caught up in, some sort of struggle. And I think it has been a true struggle for the profession in China, no doubt about it. And I wanted to kind of make my mark, maybe writing something that would contribute to that. But at the end, I think what really matters is, again, is clinical practice and how well you do it. And, you can be a virtuoso in many different ways. You can, and that may be sort of, you may be a virtuoso by virtue of, I don't know, being a specialist on the treatise of cold damage, but you may also be really great because you're just like super innovative in the way you combine Western medicine and Chinese medicine, and the way you look at a particular disease and take what you need from biomedicine to kind of get a better Chinese medicine result. And so in the end, I think it's really about, I think I met plenty of doctors that I wouldn't consider to be virtuoso doctors, but I've also met plenty that were. And I think I felt like the thing that united them all was that they're just really good at their craft, although they may have approached it in some very different ways. Some of them, some doctors that I knew were extremely good clinically, they're just so proud of like how much biomedicine had come into it, and I could teach this to, they'd be telling me I could teach this to any orthopedic doctor, and he could do it too, or something like that. I was like, that's maybe not where I came politically into the project, but in the end, I really felt like this about the craft of it, and so that's sort of where I hope to end with the book, was to really celebrate that virtuosity, which I think can happen in and you can be a virtuoso even through the hybridity.
Absolutely. Well, look, you talk about those Republican doctors that had virtuosity in treating acute disease. The times they change, the culture, it changes, whether it's political or you have influences like Western medicine that are powerful, right? And they change with the time, and now they become virtuosos in treating chronic disease, or maybe even combining things in a more integrative way. So I'm going to take that as a challenge to stay open-minded in terms of what might my practice be like and what might be useful. And of course, I think it comes down to, in the end, what's helpful for our patients.
Yeah, and I think it is a challenge. I think I do think it's so easy, even for, and I find this very interesting. But I think even for doctors of Chinese medicine to get trapped in a certain framework and a certain way of doing it. Sometimes I've had this experience, of sort of trying to teach some of the just pure kind of clinical stuff. Some of the clinical things I've learned, I've had people just sort of shake their heads like, "No, I'm not going to do my acupuncture that way." And it's like, well, it really works, but I think we can become quite rigid. Sometimes I think, again, this is part of the post-colonial kind of purity, hybridity sort of dynamics that are molding us. And sometimes I step back and I think, God, I thought, probably all of us got into Chinese medicine because it wasn't alternative medicine. It was different. We wanted to break away from conventional medicine in some form, but yet then we later kind of can get trapped in our own ways of doing things. And Chinese medicine must be this, and it can't be that. And I think that was sort of one of the lessons that I had to learn many times, and I'm admittedly, I think, still learning it.
Well, Hua Da Lao, Shui Da Lao, right? Keep learning your whole life long. Well, Eric, thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed the book immensely. It's been even more fun to have this hour or so with you to go into it more, and so appreciate your scholarship, your sense of humor, and some really helpful structures that you've given me through the book to be able to think about the medicine in a larger context. So thanks for everything you do, and I can't wait to see what else you come up with from your sojourn in Taiwan.
Yep. Well, hopefully, I got some new things that are I'm working on for the next book. But I hope this, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you about it, and I hope, at least for practitioners, this can be a book that will help them kind of give a deeper or more well-rounded appreciation of the medicine they're doing and where it comes from.
Absolutely. All right. Well, until next time then.
Thank you so much. I can't wait.
When I lived in Beijing and would sit with my teachers in the digestive disorders clinic and try to parse out how they intertwine Chinese herbs with ultrasounds and pharmaceutical drugs, I wondered if I'd be able to parse out the effects of herbs from the effects of pharmaceuticals. I did not realize, as Eric points out, that these doctors were practicing a hybridized medicine, 中西结合, which is the Chinese way of saying integrated medicine, was actually a different animal than what I'd learned in school. And while I did learn a few things about herbs, it turns out I was not able to disentangle the Chinese medicine piece in a purified way. Much like in our clinics today, our patients are often using a combination of different treatments when they come to see us. It's the current way of the world. What struck me from Eric's book was the fact that Western medicine, for a variety of reasons, has become the medicine that people turn towards first. Even with its drawbacks that we might spend a little too much time complaining about, it's the dominant player in healthcare and probably will be for the foreseeable future. How does that affect us as East Asian medicine practitioners? That's a story that's still being written. The trends toward purity and hybridization, for sure, these are powerful influences, and there's plenty of room to explore either path, depending on your interest. The future is being written out of the influences of today. I'd be surprised if we weren't surprised. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.